I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We have two panelists. Jennifer Giordano-Coltart is a law partner at Kilpatrick, Townsend, and her practice focuses on IP patent prosecution and portfolio management. Jennifer has a PhD from Cornell University and a JD from Duke. And joining Jennifer is Megan Lyman. Megan is a consultant. She has her own firm, Lyman Consulting. Megan has a master's degree from the University of Colorado in molecular biology, and she has her JD from Pepperdine. Megan is also a patent prosecutor, but more of a generalist IP consultant. And so today, the two of them are going to be talking about innovation in ag tech and strategic considerations regarding that. So without further ado, Jennifer and Megan, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Oh, Megan, you're on mute.
Thanks so much, Joe. Let me just get this in the presentation mode. Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction.
Megan?
Yep.
Sorry, I think the notes view, it might. Oh no, is that the, I think I see your notes.
You can see the notes over here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, does that work?
Yeah.
Can you see the notes now?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Joe, for the introduction. I'm thrilled to be here with Jennifer. Good afternoon to everybody. I know everybody's getting a little zoomed out, but I'm glad we could meet this way. And I know we're all looking forward to meeting together soon. We wanted to talk to you a little bit about agricultural technology today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart and is passionate for both Jennifer's and mine. After all, it's a 10,000-year-old industry. It's the industry that took us from having to be nomads to being able to be settlers and be able to stay in one place. Because of that advancement, we've had our huge population increase, and it now becomes a huge challenge. By 2050, everybody knows we're going to have 10 billion people to feed. Agriculture is something that affects each of us, at least in America, about 3 times a day, depending on what your eating regimen is. And agriculture is really at this sort of point where it really needs to start changing its traditional ways. We see climate change that's affecting agriculture in and of itself, changing our harvest times and changing our growing conditions and changing the environment, but also agriculture's own role in climate change. This creates an area ripe for innovation, and an area ripe for innovation that can really pull from other technology sectors and bring those learnings in so that agriculture can advance in a more rapid manner. So with that, one of those points is really that changing growing season. In this slide, what you're looking at is
Megan?
that, yeah, it's not turning.
It did turn, but you can see the notes at the bottom. If you could drag those down, I think I was going to talk about this one.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. So in terms of climate change, as Megan was saying, like it's impacting growing seasons and conditions. So we're seeing earlier springs and delayed autumns in colder climates, which permits longer growing seasons. But in the South and in the Midwest, the traditional breadbasket of the country, growing seasons are actually shortening and the temperatures are getting hotter. And in the Southeast and further south, all around the globe, future predictions are that there'll be dramatically reduced yields in all staple crops. in the future. So additional negative impacts will be more drought, more flooding relating to rising sea levels and storms, and more pests, which can infiltrate up into northern areas and affect crops that didn't previously had to deal with these insects or other pests. So pest infiltration it's already been seen in the Southeast with, for example, citrus greening, which some of you guys may have heard of. It's one of the most serious citrus plant diseases in the world. It's caused by a bacteria that's carried by insects. And the trees produce bitter, misshapen fruit that's basically not fit for consumption. And once a tree's infected, there's no cure. So the disease has devastated millions of acres of citrus crops in the US and abroad. And if it can't be controlled, there will be no more citrus crops. And there's similar issues with bananas in more southern geographies where they're grown, where pest infiltration is just causing dramatic issues for the food industry.
That went the wrong way. There we go. That's where I'll get the hang of it. So there are a lot of challenges tackling agriculture. And to meet those challenges, AgTech has the benefit of perhaps looking at human health and in the pharma industry. Like pharma saw consolidation back in the late 80s, early 90s, and the beginning of the century, there was a major move towards consolidation. And what used to be at those big pharma companies, the sort of mantra of not invented here, had to really be thrown out, where that move towards acquisition-based pipeline and external innovations. And also similar, we'll talk later, is that the product development timeline and costs is very similar between pharma and ag tech, despite less investment funds and a lot of these differences here. So while ag tech has seen that same consolidation, and most think that consolidation is complete, which we'll talk about a little bit later, we're also seeing the same thing in ag tech, where there are a bunch of startups, and that those large ag companies are really relying on those startups for their external innovation and for their acquisition-based pipelines. The difference is that there's less investment funds that are geared towards ag. That's just a number of investors who will take on an ag tech thesis, as well as just there being less venture companies that do both that are going to have that portion of their portfolio be dedicated to agriculture. That leads to, in agriculture, when you're looking at startups in their Series A in their beginnings, they're going to have larger syndicates, larger numbers of investors that are part of that round, whether they be part of the industry or whether they be part of venture or private equity. And what that means for those companies is they are really serving a lot of diverse interests. Whereas an agriculture investor may want to see a product go into commercialization and not really care about the market, but care about the problem, venture is always going to be looking at that return on investment. So with that, as you're getting these venture groups that are making their first ag tech investments, there's definitely a higher education barrier. There's a certain amount of understanding that ag tech companies need to bring to those investors so that they can socialize what those investment amounts need to be, or what that timeline is, and what that return on investment is. Investment amounts, when you're looking at ag deals are about 10 times less than they are in pharma, where in pharma, a Series A often could be something like $100 million. In agriculture, it's probably about $5 million, $10 million. You do see one-offs where there's joint ventures, as we've seen with EarthBio, one of the companies that's represented. That was a $53 million investment, but that was with Bayer and another life science company. The return on investment, again, this goes to that education, it also is about 5 to 10x less. So they're working with less funds, with the same product development timeline and cost, with the same sort of thesis towards external innovation, with less amount to come back. So it's a big challenge. And I'll hand it off to Jennifer.
Thank you. Okay, so the agriculture and food system is incredibly diverse and multifaceted. The industry falls into many different sectors, and it sees itself in these sectors, and which, while they intersect, each of them have their own issues. So we're going to talk about a subset of these sectors today, and I will compliment Megan on her lovely icons that she created. We've got crop protection, plant fitness improvement, novel farming systems, animal health, innovative food, and in the smart ag sectors, agribusiness and digital ag. So before we get too far in, we realized that we could have a kind of a diverse audience here in terms of background. So we wanted to briefly touch on some terms that'll come up in the discussion. Thank you. Okay, so the first three definitions on this slide relate to the creation of organisms with new characteristics. So in plants, these are referred to as traits. Most people have heard of the term GMO, standing for a genetically modified organism. So this is an organism, such as the plant, that has new DNA introduced into it. The new DNA is typically a gene that's not normally present in the genome of the plant or the organism, and the new gene is what is giving the organism that new characteristic. So the term gene editing refers to altering the normal DNA of an organism using biotechnology methods. So one of the most significant new technologies that can be used for gene editing is CRISPR technology, which some of you may have heard of. It definitely made the news in 2019 in the human health market with the news coming out of China of a gene-edited baby girl that was born and IVF had involved use of CRISPR technology. And the third one is breeding. So this is cultivating plants or breeding animals the old-fashioned way. Think dog breeding. And so you're breeding, you're selecting for a particular characteristic. So then we have biologics. And so this is kind of a catch-all term used to refer to a range of active compositions that are made usually by biotechnology methods, as opposed to chemically synthesized small molecules. So these include peptides, natural or engineered microorganisms like bacteria, or fermented products, which can form metabolites. Then we have nucleic acids. So these are RNA or DNA molecules. They can be genetic material that encode proteins, like parts of genes, like cDNA or mRNA, or they can have other functions like RNAi or double-stranded RNA, which will impact gene expression. So the last two terms on the slide are relate to novel farming systems. So vertical farming is a sector of indoor farming in which plants are grown in a controlled environment in vertically stacked layers. And lastly, aquaculture refers to rearing aquatic animals or cultivating aquatic plants for food. This can be freshwater, saltwater, and it's an alternative to commercial fishing and harvesting. That's it.
So with that, we'll start doing just a kind of overview of each of those agricultural sectors. And we can start off with crop protection. So this includes pesticides. So we're talking about herbicides, which are weed killers, insecticides, fungicides, bactericides, all of the things that are killing the bad things that are helping your crop not grow. So without pesticides, it's something, it's a neat fact that I don't know that a lot of people know, that without the use of pesticides, we would lose about half of our wheat and 80% of our cotton. So this is something that's hypercritical in order to meet that need of feeding those 10 billion people in 2050. It's a huge problem when we look at how we're going to be sustainable in the future. So even as these pesticidal products are protecting our plants, there's really a lot of pushback from the public on using a lot of these chemistries. And a lot of those chemistries you suffer from a lack of innovation. Many of them were developed near World War II. There just really hasn't been a push to innovate within this area. Even so much so that within this area, we're starting to see a lot of bans come up in the EU from a lot of the chemistries that were developed a long time ago. But without them, we won't be able to feed everybody. So we need to create new pesticides and have innovation with that area. And this can be through small molecules, which is through chemistries. Those chemistries can be either novel for agriculture or they can be pulled from other areas like animal health and human health. But these new chemistries, as we're developing them now and have such a better handle on chemistry since the 1940s, can hopefully be more sustainable, have less impact on the environment, be more efficacious so that they can be used at lower doses. And in concert with some of the other sectors that we're talking about, like digital ag, can be applied as needed basis rather than as a custom. In terms of nucleic acids, here we're really talking mostly about RNAi. And its ability to be delivered into a plant and to protect the plant from pesticides. The delivery of that is starting to get better, but we haven't seen any products come from there. One of the areas that's relatively new is the biologic approach. This approach is really attractive, both from a development cost timeline, but also from a regulatory point. So you do see a lot of interest from both venture and the industry in developing new biologics. The difficulties with them is that often they do not reproduce in the field as they do in the greenhouse, and they are large. They're very large molecules, so you need to be able to figure out a way for them either to make an effect in the soil and be taken up by the plant, or perhaps you're developing insecticides that are eaten by the insect, so they have their own challenges, as well as traits, as Jennifer had mentioned. I mean, one of the greatest traits that does get a lot of heat is the BT trait. The BT trait is the insertion of an endotoxin into the plant, into the cotton, that allows the bollworm, when it eats the cotton, to die. And as a result, 50% of cotton would be lost from the bollworm without it. It's allowed cotton and other varieties to be grown in areas that they just couldn't grow before. With that, we'll talk about plant fitness.
Great. So, we talked earlier about how climate change is impacting, the environment where so much of agricultural crops are grown. Well, one strategy to address this is to create crops capable of growing in more challenging environments. So I would say, like, plants fight where they stand. Like, they're not going anywhere, so they have to deal with their environment. So making plants hardier so they can withstand and grow well in environmentally stressful conditions like drought or nutrient poor soil, or adding components into the environment to offset these conditions, is key. And, regardless of the environment, increasing yield of an agricultural product, regardless of the conditions, is always a major driving force and desirable. So you can increase plant fitness in a few different ways. So, for example, you can modify the gene, one or more genes in the plant, by gene editing or breeding. So this would be creating a new trait, a new seed line. So, for example, you can cause the changes that you make could cause a plant to grow stronger, longer roots to extract more water from the soil, or they could result in better conservation or storage of water within the plant's tissue, or to develop or cause the plant to develop more efficiently in a way so that the limited water or nutrients available to it are used effectively to result in the product that you want. You can also cause epigenetic changes in a plant. So epigenetic changes modify gene expression of an organism without actually making changes to the plant genome. And this is relatively new in the market, and definitely a lot of work being done in this space. And lastly, plant fitness can also be improved by the application of agrochemicals and soil additives like biologics into the ground, like our little schematic is showing, and providing the nutrients that can help a plant grow more efficiently. So the interesting thing, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, is the regulatory approval pathway for these types of products is actually easier than for crop protection products, like Megan was talking about, because nothing about these types of changes are pesticidal. So you're not worried about the negative impact in something potentially dying in the environment, and also they aren't genetically modified. And so those are two big categories that are regulated under US law and elsewhere. And so these products are neither. And that's it for plant fitness.
All right. Did it move forward?
Yep, there you are.
Great. So the next system we'll talk about, or section we'll talk about, is novel farming systems. And that, within the definition for today, it's really vertical indoor farming and aquaculture. As you can see in the little graph there on the right, for vertical farming, it's been an explosive amount of growth in 2013, being a $0.4 billion market, to 23 forecasted to be $6.4 billion. A number of reasons for this. Number one, I really think it is the ability to get the hardware. The hardware, like LED lighting, has really come down in price and size, and it's become very customizable. So that's one of the players. The other one is really a consumer push. People want foods that are grown more sustainably. You don't generally need to use pesticides in indoor and vertical farming. You can show your consumer exactly where your product has come from. You can grow that product right near the consumer. And then thirdly is really, efficiencies and urban planning. So vertical and indoor farming allows farming to happen anywhere. That's why some of the best startups or biggest startups like Bowery are located in New York City and New Jersey. These can literally be grown on rooftops and can solve this sort of consumer demand within the city for local produce, but can also start to address food deserts as well. So with this explosive growth within vertical farming, there comes some issues. First one being seeds, which 10,000 years ago, we started breeding those plants so that they could grow outside. And with vertical and indoor farming, that's not needed. They're not needed to deal with drought and the differences in hydration and salinity. So what can we do to these plants really to help them be more amenable to consumer preferences? What can we do to adjust the color of the plant or the nutrition of the plant or the yield of the plant? In vertical farming, there's a real issue with getting to cost parity. That's why you see a lot of lettuces as an initial crop for vertical and indoor farming, because the cost to grow the lettuce and the cost to buy it, you pay a lot more than it costs to grow it. So when you're in vertical farming, you have a little more play area, but then it just makes it critical for the size of the plant. So you think of those clamshells that you buy at the grocery store. What are the things you can do to those seeds so that that lettuce is filling the clamshell as fast as possible? Another thing is the improvements in infrastructure. And this more has to do adapting that current infrastructure to the growing algorithms for the specific plants. And there's ways of playing with blue light and white light, and red light, and all kinds of lights in order to get those sort of growing conditions and a different bolting for lettuces and get that yield up higher. So for contamination, this is kind of where pesticides would come in. But if there is a contamination at indoor site, it can cause a lot of problems because then the whole crop could be gone. So being able to segregate where there could be decontamination and detect it very early, which kind of goes back into that digital ag, so that you can contain it and remove it, is really important. And we're also seeing issues in optimizing conditions. Again, we're not growing in the soil. So really the world is your oyster. What nutrients do you think you need? How is that going to affect your yield? What kind of media would you like to use? Is it a gel? You're going to do hydroponics or aeroponics? And those are all areas that can be optimized for indoor growing. And then with aquaculture, you are seeing a lot of the same issues. Infrastructure, again, the cost has gone down. Sensors are really important in aquaculture so you can monitor the health of your animals. Contamination is also a big thing with aquaculture. There's these terrible things called sea lice that affect the salmon, and being able to address that very early is very important. And in the same optimizing considerations where you're looking at nutrients and media and feed for those animals. There are a number of approaches to addressing these challenges. New materials for growth, like we talked about, what if you're using a certain type of synthetic agar or polymer for the growth of your plants? What if you're using black soldier army flies for your feed for your salmon? The use of creating software that's going to move those lights and those conditions for growing in an automated way. Breeding for seeds and AI machine learning, that can also be breeding, but it also can be in those growing algorithms. Hydration systems is a place that we're seeing a lot of innovation, as well as automation. Having people go through and pick every single cherry tomato or have every lettuce is really quite a burden. So there's a lot of ingenuity around how can you pluck those tomatoes and sort them and pack them in very efficient ways. It's something we're seeing a lot of really interesting things.
All right. So we're going to shift a little bit from plants that we've been talking about to animals now. So animal health is, it's relevant to livestock, which everybody typically thinks of. It's relevant to horses, and it's relevant to pets, which is referred to as the companion animal health market or companion animal market. So in many ways, innovation in animal health is really similar to the human health market. So it's the same types of drugs that are being developed in both. You have therapeutic drugs, you have vaccines, you have antibiotics. With animals, in terms of in all the markets, gene editing is also an option that can be looked at more easily than in human health, for modifying either animal health or fitness or even desirable market characteristics for consumers. In addition, health sensors and trackers are also useful for monitoring overall animal health, particularly in livestock situations. Not that anybody's going to slap an Apple Watch on any of the chickens in the yard, but their sensors do have their use, and that fits into, again, the smart tech, the digital ag aspect of things. So it's fairly common for treatments that are already approved for human use to transition to the animal health market. One that has impacted a lot of people personally in some instances are cancer therapies. So especially when your beloved pet is diagnosed with cancer, a lot of times what they're being treated with are therapies that transition from the human market into the animal market. So for drugs, regulatory approval follows a similar but separate process for approval overseen by the FDA's Department of Veterinary Medicine, which has different trial requirements and timing requirements. However, there can be interplay between the clinical trials that have been done for the human health approval with the animal health approval process, with data from human health trials, in some instances being able to be used to support the animal health application for approval. So one issue that this market faces is that there are several restrictions in place controlling the use of antibiotics in animal health. And this is a big factor for commercial livestock. So the restrictions are really important to address public health concerns about the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, but antibiotics are an integral and critical tool for maintaining the health of livestock. And so restrictions on the use of these types of drugs cause a lot of challenges as well. That's it for animal health.
All right. And with that, sort of animal-based, but also plant-based, a merger of the two, we come to the very popular innovative food section, which for us is including cultured meat, novel ingredients, and plant insect-based proteins. You can see there on the graph on the right, similar to our indoor farming graph, the market for this is really just exploding. That darkest green bar being plant-based, and then the lighter blue being microorganism, and the last one being animal cell-based. This really is a multi-segmented market. It really is extraordinarily consumer-driven. And that consumer drive is really a balance between perception and reality. The perception from consumers seems to be that this is really a more sustainable choice rather than traditional livestock, that it could be more healthy and nutritious, and it actually could be more available at a more equitable basis. That said, to date, the carbon footprint of innovative food is at least as large as traditional livestock. Now, they are going to move towards that, but right now, a lot of those arguments don't quite live up to truth at this point. Cost parity is another thing, perception for reality. Now, Impossible Foods has done a very good job at getting their ground meat down and into the consumer at a cost-conscious point. But some of these cell-based meats, their first meat, I think one of them is making salmon. The first piece of salmon they made cost $5,000. So they're going to need to get that cost parity down quite a bit before they can roll that out to consumers. And then also the health claims. So the health claims, there's really, we do think that plant-based things are more healthy. In this case, because they are doing a lot to the texture, whether that's really true or not, it remains to be seen. We have 2 slides here for you on innovative food. So with this really is a complex regulatory approval. And there are things on labeling as well. I mean, there's a reason it says impossible foods and not hamburger, right? There are rules on what they can call themselves, which then can lead to a lot of consumer confusion. There are consumer preferences when you're going to be making, especially a plant-based protein. What is the texture? What is the taste? If you're using peas, is there a way to modify those plants so you can get rid of that pea flavor that a lot of people don't like? A lot of people like the heme that's in the burger. That's what's going to produce that sort of blood-like property. And can you put heme into the plant? The answer is yes. But a lot of the innovation with this is really driven by consumer preferences and consumer demands as to what they think that meat should look like. Approaches, some of the issues, again, there's a lot of cost that's involved with this. So there's specialized manufacturing. So being able to get this down to cost parity while reducing the carbon footprint is something that this industry really tries to innovate around. They're also using gene editing, and that's on the plant side, but also on the cultured meat side, because they really are striving to get what looks like in this somewhat disturbing petri dish, where you have the fibrous tissue, but also you have those striations of fat throughout as well. They really want it to look exactly like it would look if it was off of a live animal. And breeding systems, that more goes towards the plant-based with the introduction of artificial intelligence into breeding regimes. Being able to breed for a pea without pea taste is something that's becoming quite a reality, and can happen quite rapidly. And in some cases might be more palatable than going the gene editing route in terms of regulatory systems. With that, we will finish with agribusiness and digital ag.
Okay, so let's talk about the ever-growing smart sectors of the ag market. So we've categorized what we're going to talk about today as agribusiness and digital ag, but there's a lot of fluidity and overlap between these sectors. And I also note that Megan and I are biologists, not engineers or computer scientists. So, but we're going to hit the highlights here because these sectors are so important. So smart ag is a paradigm shift in the industry. A big aspect of this is the servitization of the market. So in simplest terms, it's industries using their products to sell an outcome as a service rather than kind of one-off sales. So the technology and wide-ranging data is used to guide and modify farming systems for efficient, effective, and safe production of food. So agribusiness, what we're talking about in this talk, is technology being developed and used to better interface farmers, producers with suppliers at the downstream market, or other aspects of the market. So it can assist with seed selection, production issues, food safety, traceability, farm management, processing technology, leasing, insurance, and many other issues. So for example, farmers can provide information about their land, their methods, how their crops are doing, like soil conditions, yield, pathogens, that kind of thing, and in turn be provided with recommendations on, the best seed selection for their next crops and fertilizer or nutrient use, as well as even given supplier options and or prices. The technology can also help with traceability, as I mentioned, which really facilitates food safety by permitting source identification. There's definitely been waves of, product recalls for food over the years. And so this could be an aspect that could help with that. There's also software solutions that can help facilitate and automate complex decisions and work. So for example, it can be used to track and manage for farmers that are eligible, carbon credits that are generated through sustainability practices. So a challenge with this industry is that farmers like to keep what they do pretty close to their chest. So their business practices, what the condition of the land is, how their crops are doing. That's not something that they share traditionally very widely. And so an aspect of this is going to be buy-in, which will require like really showing benefit and a lot of communication by the industry to the farmers. And so on to the next slide, which we're shifting a little bit to digital ag. So in the context of this discussion, digital ag is the smart equipment and the software that makes agribusiness feasible. So these are the drones that can monitor vast acres of crops, and the smart tractors that can seed or treat land on a square foot by square foot basis, or that can harvest efficiently. So Megan was talking about harvesting in the context of vertical farming, but harvesting in the context of traditional agriculture is incredibly labor intensive. And so this is an aspect of innovation for digital ag as well. These are also, this kind of technology is also the sensors that can be placed across the field and help detect issues while they're more easily manageable, like, the first indications of, a pathogen being present. So together, it's also the collection and integration of environmental data using this equipment to provide farmers with very specific information about their land in a usable way. So all of this data, together with georeferenced maps and images, which is generally publicly available information, but also some of it might be proprietary, and ideally combined with farmer-sourced, crowdsourced, farm-sourced information. These systems can provide information to farmers to make educated and strategic decisions for their fields. So a challenge in this industry, a big one, is really processing the vast amount of data being collected, analyzing it, and then presenting it to the farmer in a way that it's actually useful. Like an example, we mentioned the drones. How many images need to be stitched together and processed, and then the data extracted in a way that farmers can actually use this powerful new tool. And then also another challenge is, or it's a challenge, but it's also like such a focus for future innovation is around automation. So it's like I talked about with the harvesting and also with the drones, it's how do you have automation around reliable, independent drone scouting and automatic reporting, where you're removing the need for operators to be heavily involved in the whole process. So those are challenges that technology and smart people will solve. But another challenge, which that was mentioned with regards to agribusiness, is again getting that buy-in from farmers, because they typically, not even with their neighbors, want to share the kind of information that's so integral to their businesses. So getting that on the ground information sourced from farmers will take time and investment from the industry to get that buy-in.
So with that kind of completes our overview. I'm looking at the time, and I'll try to speed it up a little bit so we can get through things. We're going to take just a little bit. We're looking at the business model in the context of what IP, how IP plays into it. So it's important to kind of understand what the markets look like and what the business model for agriculture is when we're developing these IP portfolios. So as we talked about, new agriculture, it's really a kind of, people talk about ag revolution. You can Google it and find a number of articles that's talking about this huge amount of investment that's coming in and all of this innovation surrounding agriculture. And what that's really centered around is getting increased yield, those consumer preferences, really this push to be efficient and sustainable, and consumers' expectations. Consumers are really expecting a much higher quality of their produce on the whole, and those abilities to manipulate things like indoor farming and different proteins, and even using digital ag so that we can shorten that supply chain, helps meet those consumer demands. And we're looking at, as Jennifer said very well, that digitization of agriculture. And that's been a little bit slower to adopt by the farmers, but by adopting that, they're going to be able to increase that consumer proximity and give that greater transparency, which that's, when you do your QR code on your lettuce and you see that was grown 20 miles away, and that makes you feel happy. But that's also, you go and you get your food at somewhere and they're able to recall it as soon as it comes home, because there's that enhanced food safety and transparency. And that leads to, your enhanced customer experience. And we discussed this a little bit more. I think we're going to show a chart on it, is that with that consolidation, we're also seeing shifts in that value chain. There's an increasing price pressure, and there's an increased competitiveness among brands. There's a stronger set of integrated competitors because those competitors are so small in number, it's 4. And there's a blurred boundary between that agriculture and supply sectors. It used to be very much front end and back end. And as we are able to make things more efficient, we're seeing those start to merge.
Okay, picking up on that, I am going to cut down what I was going to say about this slide just in terms of time constraints. But as Megan said, there's been significant industry consolidation in the agrochemical and seeds market over the last decade. So these are companies that are focused on crop protection, plant fitness, and new traits. They are creating these products, they're putting their seeds out into the market, and these are the crops that are being grown around the world and the chemicals that are being applied to the fields. So just 5 years ago, the industry had the big 6. That's what they were referred to. And then in rapid succession over the last 5 years, the market consolidated down to the big 4, and business assets really shifted around. So I think the diagram kind of speaks for itself. Of interest in particular that Megan will touch on in a couple slides was the acquisition of Syngenta by state-owned ChemChina, largely driven by China's need for future food security. So most innovation is in this sector of the market really is coming from these private companies, though there has been an increase with public collaborations kind of over the years. The big 4 also have their eye on external innovation, as Megan touched on earlier. It's an acquisition-based R&D pipeline. So each of BASF, Bayer, and Syngenta have their own investment groups, and Corteva has an innovation department that's focused on collaborations and partners. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the big 4, however, are not alone in investing into the ag industry. So we love this slide because it's lots of pretty colors, but it also really speaks a amazing story here. So deal making in ag has been increasing for almost a decade, but has skyrocketed over the last 5 years. So this slide shows the huge range of diversity in the different market sectors where investment is happening in ag, well beyond the few that we're talking about today, as it's looking at the food industry as a whole. And I think that's it for this slide, unless Megan, you had anything else to add here.
No, that's great. I do like how it highlights you. I think we're showing you maybe 6 sectors that there are quite a few more. And now we can shift more towards the intellectual property sort of focus. And why is intellectual property important? It's because those really are companies' intangible assets. If you're looking at the S&P, that's 90% of the value of today's companies. And if you're thinking, what are intangible versus tangible assets? So tangible assets are really buildings and equipment, cash bonds, inventory. Maybe on the agribusiness side, this comes into play when you're talking about your land and your leases, your silos and your barns. But we're really focused on the intangible access, which is really the majority of the value. And that's the host of IP, which you think about, like patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets, licenses, and consumer data. So Jennifer was talking about with agribusiness and digital ag. And this is important also from the investment side too. So this is important when you're helping companies come up with their foundational intellectual property, because the ventures are getting a bit more savvy. It's not so much saying back of the napkin patent applications have been filed. They're likely to go ahead and look at those patent and trademark applications. And they're likely to look at your trade secret policy and see what previous licenses that you have if you're working with technology transfer for your technologies. So it's just to say, this is a really robust and important part of any company's value. So you look at where that intellectual property is coming from. This is where the origin of patent filings have been since the 2000s. If you went back 10 years earlier, it might look the same. You see a lot of that innovation coming out of the United States and Southeast Asia, as well as in the EU. And that's to be expected. What's somewhat interesting about this is the application of agricultural biotech. So if you were to overlay this in terms of where soy is grown, you would see Brazil light up like a light bulb, because that's where the majority of soy is grown. I think it was 140 billion tons or something like that. It's a ton of soy. So it's not grown there, and there's not innovation happening there. So it just goes to show the collaboration, the importance of international filings in this area, and that these companies that are innovating really have a far reach internationally. So with that, we would be remiss to talk about international jurisdictions without talking just a little bit about China. And this graph is just for all PCT applications, so it's not focused on agriculture. And so for the last 2 years, China has become the top filer. In agriculture, the reason being they have a national security interest as the holder of 1.4 billion of Earth's people. The China's, and when you look at that, that's not something that we've seen traditionally, and you can see how far that line has gone up since 2015. Within that, there are a trend in a lot of the filings only being filed in China. In fact, 97% of their filings in China remained only in that jurisdiction. And that could be due to certain promotions that the country has done. But even still, this graph is PCT and really does show what a large player that they have become on the national stage of intellectual property. And part of that is that China is really doing a lot to increase the enforceability of intellectual property and give international applicants more confidence in their system. Their intellectual property agency has been issuing dispositions in favor of international IP rights. There was just a case with Bayer where Bayer won a large amount of damages from that group. Also, we're looking at, they have filed 612,000 patents between 2015 and 2019. I mean, that's a huge amount of intellectual property. So when you're looking at with ag, knowing that it's this national security interest, it's something for the companies that you may represent or that you're doing landscapes on, that while it may not have been a consideration in the past, or maybe a low consideration, this is something to really think about, whether it's being filing in China or looking at those applications that only exist in China but are still creating prior art for your innovations.
Okay, I was going to tell a lovely history story on this one, but I think I'm going to be a bit more brief in view of the time. So this is a timeline showing kind of the growth of patent filings for plant biotechnology against, key technological, patent law, and regulatory developments. So these are patent filings relating to modified plants. And you can see, from left to right that, the evolution of the technology. You see Diamond v. Chakrabarty coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court saying that, confirming that genetically modified organisms could be patentable or were patent eligible. You have the USPTO extending utility patent protection to plants for the first time in the early 90s. Prior to that, there were only plant patents available or plant varietal protection certificates for those. And Megan will talk about that in a minute. So commercialization efforts kind of proceeded through the 80s and 90s, and you see the increasing number of filings occurring. And then in the mid to late 90s, there's essentially an EU moratorium on approval of any new genetically modified crops in Europe. And then with the very late 90s, early 2000s, the EU issued its new GMO regulations, which were the strictest in the world. But you still see that innovation, as represented by patent filings, is continuing. There's a dip that coincides with the 2008 recession, which impacted patent filings across all technology areas. But in the midst of that dip, you see the development of CRISPR technology, which I talked about earlier. And you can see the graph ends at 2015, but there's a pretty strong spike going up there, and no doubt having been fueled, at least to some extent, by the CRISPR technology, which is probably the most important technological development since the development of agrobacterium-mediated gene transfer into plants, which was back in the early 80s. So one thing I'll just mention briefly, it's not shown on this slide, but in 2015, the EU issued a rule that permitted member countries and regions to opt out of allowing the growing of genetically modified crops within their borders, and a large number of member countries and regions have opted out. So in terms of growing genetically modified crops in Europe, it's not it's a difficult market. So next slide, please.
Now we're going to kind of go back towards our agricultural sectors and talk about just some more IP sort of regulatory driven considerations. So when we're talking about breeding and editing, that goes for indoor growing or for plant fitness or for whatever the sorts of traits you're trying to achieve. There are a number of ways of protecting that. The most well-known to probably this audience exists on the far right, which is plant patents. And as we know, that's a 20-year protection. You can see that that really applies to asexually reproduced plants, algae, and macrofungi. There are deposits required, and it's available in many different jurisdictions. Another one that maybe not so well known is PVP, that's plant variety protection. That's registered through the USDA. That's 25 years of protection, and that's for new, distinct, uniform, stable, and sexually reproduced or other tuber propagated plant varieties. There are a number of exemptions to PVP, like research purposes. If you're working with the startup and they're using that, then as long as it's still on the research stage, it's okay. Farmers are allowed to bulk their own seeds. And if the USDA deems it necessary to revoke PVP, then they may. The third one exists under the TRIPS agreement, which is a little bit more well-known now than it was a couple of months back, as for members of the World Trade Organization. And that's 20 years, or if it's a woody plant, then it's 25 years. That's housed under the UPOV. That's where you can have the database and you would submit your seeds. And owners have rights to the production or reproduction, export, import, stocking, and conditioning of those seeds. Now for this, in PVP and in breeders' rights, there's a required deposit of something like 300 seeds. So you can imagine in some cases, very few, there's overlap where seeds could be protected through more than one. Developing on the timeline and the timeline cycle, there could be utility patents that go to plants that are not exactly plant patents that are filed very early, but then it's going to take a while to get those 300 uniform seeds, and then PVP might kick in a little bit later. Another thing, when you're looking at freedom to operate, PVP and breeders' rights, the USDA site and the UPOV, they're a little bit harder to navigate than the USPTO to find out if someone owns those seeds. So it's a little bit of a murkier area, but it is a great area if you're creating new seeds and are able to protect them that way.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about strategic considerations in some of the markets we talked about earlier. So sticking with crop protection, so this slide, the graph shows market data and projections from 2010 to 2031. And the modified seed market is currently valued at about $28 billion and is predicted to hit about $44 billion in 2031. So while breeding and GMO products have maintained a fairly consistent market share over the past 10 years, the gene edited sector, which is the green sector you start to see growing, is just taking off. And that's what's expected to really drive industry growth in the future. So the investment needed to develop and bring these products to market is substantial. And Megan touched on it earlier. It takes time and a lot of money. GMOs take about 10 to 20 years, $135 million. Gene edited seeds take much less time and money, so about $20 million in about 2 years. And that's mainly because of them being less regulated. And conventionally bred seeds take anywhere from $5 to $100 million in 2 to 20 years, which is based primarily on the nature of the trait being developed in the crop. So besides the R&D component, regulatory approval really is the biggest hurdle for these products. So regulation of modified crops and food has been complicated in the US, with responsibility falling between overlapping roles of the FDA, the EPA, and the USDA, each with their own applicable regulations. And this is referred to as the Coordinated Framework for Regulation of Biotechnology, which or the Coordinated Framework, and that was enacted in 1986. So last year, the USDA finalized what it calls its SECURE rule. And SECURE is a really long acronym that's kind of silly, so I'm not going to tell it to you. But it exempts from regulation gene-edited plants that could have been developed through conventional breeding techniques. So it's permitting certain modifications. So this brings regulation for these types of products more in line with conventionally bred crops, which are considered to have manageable risks, which goes into regulatory law, but it's a different level of regulation and oversight. So this leaves GMO crops as the most heavily regulated products in the seed market. Other than gene-edited crops being exempted through the SECURE rule, seeds whose traits are based on epigenetic approaches, which don't change the genome of the plant, are the quickest to market after research and development because they just have less regulation over them. So the biggest thing to hit crop technology, like I mentioned, has been CRISPR. And this could be the focus of an entire presentation on its own. So the key things to know about this is that there's ongoing disputes over the patent rights for this technology, with multiple parties having ownership claims. Each side's rights have consolidated somewhat for licensing purposes, at least particularly within the ag industry. So use of this technology might require licensing of IP rights from both sides of the ownership fight, if certainty on freedom to operate is what the company desires. And then just as briefly discussed on the timeline slide, the EU is not a friendly market for any kind of modified crops right now, which is a really important consideration for product development. And that's it for that one.
Okay, a few considerations for crop protection. So this is what we talked about before. If you're in crop protection, that means you're saying a pesticide, which according to the EPA is any substance or mixture that's intended to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate any pest. So that's anything that's killing a pathogen. And the second part is really that's killing any weed. So if you're killing a weed or a pathogen, then you're considered a pesticide, so you're regulated by the EPA. That brings us to our chart that really goes through those three different approaches and what those considerations are. As Jennifer was going through the developmental timeline for biotechnology crops, the cost and time for synthetic chemistry, about $130 million in about 10 years for regulatory. Those of you that are coming from pharma may look at that and say, oh, that looks familiar. It's because it is familiar. It's very, very similar, even though it's a different regulatory agency. As we keep going down with synthetic chemistry, that IP is meant to be in there thickets where there's no composition of matter. Composition of matter really being that gold standard that every company wants to have. But understanding that in agriculture, there's a lot of synthetic chemistry out there that's been used for other purposes that kills worms and kills other things that can be applied from animal health to human health. So even if that scaffold can't be protected by that company, protecting formulations, polymorphs, process manufacturing could be places where there's IP. And I say that process chemistry, process manufacturing, because those chemistries that were developed for pharma and animal health maybe didn't have to be super efficient in their process chemistry. Right now, to be in ag, your product needs to cost about $5 per acre. So to get down to $5 per acre, you're going to have to pretty good, efficient process chemistry. So that's something that when the chemists actually go in there and do that, whether it's protecting intermediates or the process itself, it could be fruitful IP. You'll see a tick across all of life cycle management. This is really a distinction between pharma. There's no Hatch-Waxman. So when you're talking about life cycle management, your new formulations and your new combinations, which are important in ag, all bring new life to that active ingredient. Regulatory is all through the EPA. The crop market selection for synthetic chemistry, like we were talking about, as the EU has banned many of these chemistries and improvements thereof, that may be a group that you may not be going through versus going to other markets like Brazil that are more amenable to synthetic chemistry and really find it more advantageous because it's more traditional with their line of thinking. Manufacturing and synthetic chemistry, you're probably going to see it being more international, and thus you might have IP filings where it's being manufactured like in China or in India. EU ban considerations are an issue in synthetic chemistry, like we've talked about, and there really aren't patentability issues. If you have a new scaffold, and it really is new, it's one of the most patentable things you can get. It's an unpredictable art. It's great for us IP attorneys. Looking at biologics, you see that cost and time go down significantly. That's because there aren't as many environmental concerns as those sort of products break down. So they really don't have as much regulatory scrutiny as synthetic chemistry. However, if you isolated a great microbe and it might be found in nature and you're putting it on a plant to recruit other things to the rhizosphere, that naturally occurring microbe probably is not patentable. So you need to think about the IP considerations when you're developing things like that. The difference here, manufacturing is likely going to be domestic, so that may change where your filings lie. And there's patentability issues similar to nucleic acids. Similar cost and developmental timeline, similar considerations for patentability, regulatory, market selection, and manufacturing.
Okay, so we are pretty much, we've got four minutes, I've been told, before we absolutely have to be cut off. We have slides on animal health and innovative food, and again, the smart technologies. For animal health, we covered a lot of it before. It's very similar to the human market. You've got different regulatory bodies involved. There's a green book instead of an orange book, which it'll be familiar with to anybody with the human market. But there's no Hatch-Waxman, and so that isn't something that you get with animal health products. Licensing issues, you kind of take into account the fact that you've got therapeutics that are moving from human health into animal health. So you're looking at IP assets, whether you have coverage, whether it's for licensing or freedom to operate, and taking into account royalties for a smaller market. And then life cycle management, very similar to what Megan was talking about in terms of crop protection with follow-on filings relating to delivery or formulations or dosing, especially since a lot of these therapeutics will come out of human health, and patent life on the original patents covering composition of matter probably won't have a ton of life left on the end of it. And time investment, somewhat shorter maybe than human health, but definitely lower cost, but not inexpensive. So with that, I think we probably need to wrap it up. Is that right, Anne? We can take questions. Oh, actually, I just saw that we can.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you guys want to go, I'll just have to cut it off really at 1:20, like no longer than that. I have to.
Okay.
So
yeah.
You keep going a little bit longer. You have a lot left, so I want to make sure you get it all in.
Okay. Go ahead, Megan.
I'll run through it very, very fast. So in innovative food, this is interesting from an IP protection standpoint, whereas generally we're claiming the molecules or the pathways or the mode of action on how things work. And in food, we're starting to see claims really go towards the texture, towards the taste, sort of characterizing the end product, this sort of functional claiming. And while this is really valuable, especially in the innovative food, a lot of the case law is starting to come down on functional claiming in not a great way. So using a blended approach is going to be something that's important when you're drafting these types of claims. If you know the mode of action or you know the pathway that's being affected to order to attain those characteristics of your innovative food, then you will protect it in that sense. This is what we kind of talked about. So just an example of that complicated regulatory pathway. For cell-based meats, depending on what stage they are, they're either going to be regulated by the FDA or the USDA through the Food Safety Inspection Service. So at the beginning, the FDA is going to oversee all cell collection, and they're going to coordinate with that EFSIS with livestock and poultry and food products and seafood. And then in the middle site, they have shared oversight for harvest and principles for labeling, as well as food safety. But then it goes back to the USDA's FISIS in terms of inspecting the manufacturing establishment, which makes sense. The USDA does that type of work, approval of the verification levels, enforcement actions, and coordinating with the FDA. So you can see with that, even when one of those regulatory bodies is really in charge, they are still giving transparency to the other agency in that process. Contrast, plant-based foods are going to just be regulated by the FDA. And labeling is regulated under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So only animal-derived foods can use words like meat, sausage, and burger. That's why you're seeing all of these different crazy words being used for impossible foods and some of the other ones that really are completely irrelated to meat because they're restricted in that way.
All right, and then a final few comments on the smart ag. So, this graph does a nice job of showing how the industry is growing. It's expected to grow to $25 million by 2028, and the market's distributed kind of worldwide. So these are addressing issues wherever food is grown or sold, which is everywhere. So there are several options available for protecting software inventions, including patents and copyrights and trademarks. The software industry was significantly impacted over the last decade with changes under US law for patent eligibility of software technology. While not perfect, things have stabilized and there are ways forward, particularly for artificial intelligence, machine learning based technologies, which will have a big role in smart ag. The validity of older IP might be questionable, but these sectors are ripe for new innovation and new filings. A very recent decision by the Supreme Court came out that it is permitted to do some amount of copying of copyrighted software on the grounds of fair use. So that's something that companies in this space need to keep in mind. And so as a result, a strong IP strategy around software-based technology will be a blend of copyrights and patents and trade secrets as much as possible, together with trademarks and advertising to help provide brand recognition and consumer recognition. So that was it on the smart ag. And so we hit our last slide. So the take home is that ag tech is growing and diverse. There's multiple different sectors within ag, and each of them are doing wonderful things and addressing important problems and having different issues. And as with any other market, a robust IP portfolio is critical in ag tech. And for a lot of ag tech sectors, the regulatory strategy is also critical for product development. So that is it. If anyone has any questions, we actually have about 7 minutes before we are going to get cut off.
Jennifer, there is a question in the chat about what are the labeling requirements and regulations in China. In the EU, they have more strict labeling and regulatory policies, so they were wondering what the regulations were in China.
That is outside my knowledge. Megan, if you have any insight?
It's outside my knowledge. Generally, China is trying to behave like the EU and the US. So I would be surprised if their labeling requirements are more lackadaisical. But the application of those and how they're used in practice could be different. It's similar to South America, where the labeling requirements are the same, but in application, it can be a little bit more looser.
Okay. Well, thank you both for the presentation. It was enjoyable, and I feel like I've learned a lot about what's going on in ag tech. So with that, we'll let